I am Susanna Baruch from the Petrie Flom Center once again. It is my honor to introduce Professor Noah Feldman, and in doing so, I will thank him yet again. It was our great good fortune that you were willing to step in when our original keynote speaker had to drop out due to the flu. For those of you who don't already know Professor Feldman, he is the Arthur Kingsley Porter University Professor, Chair of the Society of Fellows, and founding director of the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law, all here at Harvard University. He specializes in constitutional studies with particular emphasis on power and ethics, design of innovative governance solutions, law and religion, and the history of legal ideas. That's sort of the law part. Professor Feldman is also well known as a leading public intellectual. He's a prolific columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, writes for the New York Review of Books, and was a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine for nearly a decade. He has spoken to audiences on thousands of stages around the world and in every major city in the US and at many of the world's best-known conferences and summits. He also advises tech companies about ethical decision-making and governance, and he conceived and architected the Facebook Oversight Board. Professor Feldman is the author of 10 books, including his latest, To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Professor Noah Feldman.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you all very much for having me, and really thank you for being indoors, which is a somewhat masochistic act today that I will try to repay in the right way. I love being in the Divinity School. One of the most influential experiences of my undergraduate time at Harvard was taking a course with Professor John Strugnell, who was a profound expert on Dead Sea Scrolls. And the class was especially memorable because it was just me and Professor Strugnell, since I was the only person who showed up. And for an entire semester, we read Dead Sea Scrolls at 11 in the morning, once a week here in this building. The building did not look as cool as it looks now. And it really taught me everything that you could understand about how scholarship can interface with a rich and complex understanding of religious experience across, in that case, millennia. And I'm not just talking about how old he was, though it did sort of feel that way. What I'm going to try to do today is offer a picture of how the interrelated subjects of psychedelics and law, religion, and humanities can contribute to the life of the world, while simultaneously talking about how a university can engage those subjects. And I think that's a really important subject for us to think about, and it's a forward-looking subject. So this is very much a talk about where we can go in these domains. And I want to come into that forward-looking discussion by starting with a kind of overview of where I, in my very subjective, idiosyncratic perspective, think we are on these topics in what is sometimes called the psychedelic Renaissance. So to begin with, I would just say that the Renaissance is encountering some forms of resistance. Sometimes they're called headwinds. But before we all begin to panic about that, and panic is natural in life, especially when everything else in the world makes you think you should panic, I think it's worth pausing to see that the form that the resistance is taking is actually far less significant than the forms of resistance that the first encounter with psychedelics emanating from this university, from William James Hall, approximately a 3-minute walk from here, 2 if you move quickly, encountered in its era. And just to add one other autobiographical component, as a child growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the way I first heard about psychedelics was from my father, who was a social psychologist, whose office was in William James Hall, when he was a graduate student. His lab was a floor, but he was a student of Skinner and of Milgram, and his office was just one floor beneath Timothy Leary's office. And so the version that I heard as a child, this is in the middle 1970s, was the story of the rise and fall of Timothy Leary. And it was told as a morality story in several acts. Several people in this room may have actually been there. Everyone else has heard versions of this tale. But let's just say that when the resistance, as it were, to the psychedelic movement rose, things happened like Timothy Leary going to prison, Timothy Leary being broken out of prison by the Black Panthers, Timothy Leary in Algeria with the FLN-backed government. I mean, these were childhood bedtime stories for me. I know I had a very weird childhood, but that's why I have the job I have, because I had a very weird childhood. The broad cultural revanche against psychedelics, including active criminalization, the abandonment of any form of academic research, effectively the tarring of the whole movement with the brush, not just of political revolution, bad enough, but failed political revolution, which is way worse. In revolutions, it's hard to be revolutionary, but it's really bad to be a failed revolutionary. It's romantic, but, leads to the prison cell. So compared to that story, which I don't think I really exaggerated just now, even though I do see it from a child's eye view, we're doing great. I mean, seriously, everyone take a breath and realize this is not the movement to save the climate. That's not going well. I did my doctorate in Islamic studies and, helped work on constitutional reforms and drafting in places like Iraq and Tunisia. This is going way better than those things. And I think last but not least, in the struggle to preserve constitutional democracy in the current present moment, which is my day job, I don't think we're going to fail altogether to preserve constitutional democracy, but it's very substantially been eroded, just to be blunt about that. And we're doing better than that too. So that's a framing so that when I describe forms of resistance, you don't read me incorrectly as analyzing these forms of resistance in a negative or depressing or defeatist way. Okay, so let me just do a quick overview of what seemed to me, again, idiosyncratically, to be the leading forms of resistance across law, across religion, and across humanities to psychedelics. And then once I've done that, I'm going to turn to my affirmative case. And the rest of it will be the affirmative case. So it'll be mostly affirmative case, but starting with resistance. And that's just because the diagnosis is necessary in order to prescribe a cure. So in the context of law, the key challenge that psychedelics faces is that law is a universe of paradigms in which everything is supposed to fall into a preordained box. That's just how law is structured. When you're a first-year law student, you arrive with maybe your undergraduate education, God help you, maybe a PhD or a master's degree, and law school basically breaks your brain, rips it out, and tells you we're not interested in anything you've learned because those involve categories. And we're going to take out all those categories and we're going to put in new categories. And we call that thinking like a lawyer. And that's literally what law school does. My joke, but it's not a joke, to first-year students is that this is a socialized experience on par with being a first-year medical student. But the difference is when you're a first-year medical student, you dissect a cadaver. And here, we dissect your brain. Okay? And the upshot of that is supposed to be everything fits into a box. So ask the lawyers what they think of psychedelics, and they'll tell you, well, what box does it fall into? Oh, it's an illegal box. Okay, so how do we get out of the illegal box? Well, one way is through FDA approval of a therapeutic use. And that paradigm is now operative. There's capital behind it. There are multiple randomized controlled trial tests, and there are ups and there are downs. And believe me, I'm not going to talk about that at all today, but let's call that in process. Notice that within that box, and this is going to be relevant for what I say later, within that box of legalization through FDA approval of therapeutic use, the question of the internal experience of a person engaged with psychedelics what you might call the phenomenology of that experience. What's it like to be a human is the question of phenomenology. What's it like to be on psychedelics is this question of psychedelic phenomenology, is completely irrelevant. Doesn't matter at all. Under the RCT protocol paradigm, all that matters is measurable outcomes. That's nothing else that they care about. And so unsurprisingly, we even have efforts to create psychedelic therapeutic cures where there's no journey experience at all, because it's just irrelevant from the perspective of that box. If you can't get out of the illegal box through therapeutic approval, you have to look for an exemption from the law. Okay, so this is the other paradigm where law comes in. Law can give you get out of jail free cards. What does it give them for? Well, one is a religious liberty exemption under either the First Amendment to the Constitution or the Religious Freedom Restoration Act at the federal level or the state RFRAs. So there's a whole body of law around such exemptions. Ironically, the first really important Supreme Court case granting such an exemption involved ayahuasca, fascinatingly. But it turned out that that exemption took a long time and still is taking a long time to be expanded more broadly. The issue of the resistance is just that law doesn't want to give away too many get out of jail free cards, because otherwise it wouldn't be law anymore. Right? If you just give everyone a get out of jail free card, it's not law. Right? In fact, the formulation, the anti-RFRA formulation, which goes all the way back to a 19th century case involving celestial plural marriage of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, emphasizes the idea that if we gave everybody a religious freedom exemption from a general, neutrally applicable law, quote, every man would be a law unto himself. And from the standpoint of lawyers, that's the nightmare. Because if every man's a law unto himself, there is no law. There's no boxes, no law. Okay, so the resistance is natural. And for those of you who are in the room or watching on Zoom, who are within churches that have advanced cases under state or federal law seeking exemptions, you know, may God be with you, or the gods be with you, or the spirits, whoever you wish. You pick who's want to bring with you. But the reason that that's a challenging process is that the law doesn't want to give you that exemption. It doesn't mean they won't. It just means it exists not to give it to you. And other forms of exemption are even harder to get. So one would be a kind of free expression or libertarian substantive due process, don't worry about the technical terminology, argument that says, well, a human being ought to have cognitive liberty. There's a recent updating of that by two scholars at Columbia that speaks of epistemic discovery. I'm going to return to that later. The cognitive liberty argument is creative, it's interesting, it's plausible, and boy, does the law not want to give up on that one. It does not want to give up on that one, because then any number of range of human experiences that could be described as exposing us to cognitive phenomenological moments, and there are lots of them, I won't list them, you can think of them, would also have to be legalized. And so that getting out of the box is a very scary getting out of the box. And if you're Foucauldian, you think that the whole point of these boxes, you know, this might be overstated, but this is what a Foucauldian believes, is to maintain a social order exactly about your cognitive processes. And so they really don't want to give you that. Okay, so that's the law. And those are the forms of resistance there, and I'll return to that. Okay, next, religion. And here I think we have to divide the phenomenon of religion as it exists in the wild from the academic study of religion. Those are two very different things, as everybody in this room knows, whether you're on one side of that or the other side or both. Those are two different things that sometimes look like they don't even know each other. In theory, they're supposed to be cousins. They were related like 200 years ago, but it's been a while. And reunions are awkward. But from the standpoint of organized religion, the word organized basically tells you everything you need to know about the structure of resistance. right? Radically individualized experience of the kind we associate with the psychedelic resonates in the Protestant tradition. It resonates profoundly in the Protestant tradition. And the Reformation was not met by universal approbation by the Catholic Church. And a substantial part of the work of the Reformation was the reconstruction of new institutional structures to resist the radical individualism that comes from the insight that individual religious quasi-revelation, or at least engagement with conscience, is the enemy of organization. So no great shock there that we would see resistance from the standpoint of organized religion. And as for less organized religion, actually, I think doing pretty well. You know, in the disorganized world of religion, or people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, which often means I'm the most religious person you've ever met, but I won't set foot anywhere near an institutional space. But I believe in every divinity that there could be, and I'm followed by ministering angels wherever I go. I mean, you laugh, but that's, you know, that's just the Friday night prayers in Jewish tradition. So that person is generally pretty open. So I think from the standpoint of organized religion, that's the source of the resistance. From the standpoint of the academic study of religion, there's a series of considerations, but I think the most significant of them is if a crucial component of the study of religion is understanding the pathways, social, epistemic, experiential, by which individual people through institutions approach however the divine, however they think of it, if it turns out that there are mechanisms for that approach, I like having a soundtrack. If there are mechanisms that shape or govern that approach, I'm gonna start dancing soon, that have not been accounted for, with the partial exception of William James, the guy for whom Timothy Leary and my father's office building is named. None of this is coincidental, let's just be really clear. But if with the exception of William James, that's a dimension that hasn't been deeply well explored, then that is not good for the organized study of religion, the organized study of organized religion. It's not outrageous, which is why we are in the Divinity School having this conversation. It's why the Divinity School in most ways has been more open to the study of psychedelics than the rest of the university. But that's a low bar. Okay? So that brings me to the resistance from the humanities writ large. I'm going to spend a moment on that, and then I'm going to give you my affirmative picture. The resistance from the humanities writ large, I think, has to do with something that actually has almost nothing to do with psychedelics itself. And it has to do with how the humanities thinks about its subjects of engagement. The humanities has organized itself. Organization is a word I'm clearly using too much here, but it's relevant when we talk about forms of resistance, because if you organize something, that's how you resist. If you're disorganized, it's hard to resist anything. So humanities has organized itself around fields like literature, philosophy, and history, just paradigmatically. And those are fields that describe certain forms of human endeavor rather than that name, the field's name, the names of those fields describe certain forms of human endeavor, rather than describing specific experiences or objects or mechanisms or products. So if you say, fiat lux, let us create a field of psychedelic humanities, the humanities' instinctive reaction to that is, well, you can use the tools of the humanities to study psychedelics. By all means, we hope you will, because that's a subject matter. But you can't modify the whole humanities with the adjective psychedelic unless you're suggesting that psychedelics or psychedelicism is somehow a whole field of human endeavor. They would say something like, that's like saying there should be a field of alcoholic humanities. Not alcoholic humanists, that's a separate thing. So, and someone would say, well, if we're actually interested in studying alcohol in the humanities, there's actually a huge literature on it. Go all the way back to the literatures that are now hot again about the birth of civilization and the rise of grain and which came first, beer or bread, one of the most recurring questions in anthropology and a question that humanists have also taken a big interest in. That's a question that humanists would engage on and do engage on. How are we to make sense of the centrality of wine, a lot of wine, to the Islamic mystical experience in the Balkan, in what my friend Shahab Ahmed called the Balkans to Bengal complex? That's a central theme in Shahab's his masterpiece, a book called What is Islam? And it's a profoundly humanistic question, and he engaged it with all the humanistic tools. But that is a book within the domain of Islamic studies, and within that, broadly within the realm of the study of religion and philosophy and literature. So a lot of the resistance from the humanities is about how the subject matter is framed. But the key for the humanities is to see examples of works of literature, of philosophical problems, of historical questions where psychedelic topics arise. And through that, it's possible over time to construct what will be a subfield in some sense, because it will be a subject matter field. So you can say Islamic studies. And so in principle, you could say psychedelic studies. It's harder to say Islamic humanities, although I suppose one could seek to construct that formulation. But it's not the standard locution. So I think that's an important part of the resistance coming for the humanities, as is, and I'll just mention this, humanists are very insecure people. I'm a humanist, so I'm speaking on my own, for myself. Humanists are insecure people because first in my father's generation, and mother's generation, they were both social scientists. It was the rise of the social sciences. This is kind of from post-World War II, gets you right into the 1970s. And then we got the re-rise of biology. Physics was there the whole time. So you got a re-rise of the natural sciences. And the humanists were looking around and saying, like, where are my students? That's been an ongoing change. I have 2 kids in college. They both are going to major in English. And my first thought when they told me was, gosh, English department's there are a lot of kids majoring in English. And so it's sometimes really hard, even if you've got a great department, to get attention. And my kids were like, Dad, you're so out of touch. It's embarrassing. Nobody majors in English. I was like, oh, good point. Definitely major in English. Amazing faculty who love you. No competition from other students. So, that insecurity expresses itself in a range of ways. But one of the ways that insecurity expresses itself, it's an institutional insecurity, not a personal insecurity. The institutional insecurity comes in wondering, is a topic a flash in the pan? So if you say this was a big topic in the 60s until around 1975, they're like, we study phenomena that last 300 years minimum. You can do a micro project within that, but unless you have a long stretch, it's not going to lead to a good book. It's not going to lead to a dissertation. It's not going to definitely lead you to 10. Okay, so that's yet another reason. Okay, so that's my view of the resistances. And again, I said earlier, I don't think any of these is all that serious, but we still do need to have a diagnostic question. And here's my diagnostic question. And now we're switching to the forward-looking part of my comments. The diagnostic question is, actually, it's twofold. Number one, what's a university good for? And number two, what are psychedelics good for? And I'll refine that to what's psychedelic experience good for? And I want to postulate to you that by answering each of those questions in juxtaposition with each other, we might have a game plan. And that's my goal. The sign said synthesis, which is what I desperately came up with when Susanna called me, because synthesis is, you can always present it as just another thesis that we can replace with another synthesis. So it's a tentative title, but it sounds really good. So this is going to be my move towards a synthesis. So what's a university good for? I'll cheat there. I'll look at the motto of this university. And I had to co-author a report recently on how the university should talk in public. And the first sentence of that report I worked really hard on, in the sense that I had to work really hard to convince everybody on the committee that it was a good first sentence. but the first sentence seemed kind of intuitive to me because I just ripped it off from the motto of the university. The university is for the pursuit of truth. Now, there's a whole lecture to be given, I'm not going to give it, about why it was that I had to convince my colleagues from a wide range of fields, distinguished scholars who were handpicked for that committee, that they should agree to that sentence. There's a whole separate story about that. And if you already live in a university, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't live in a university, you shouldn't know from such troubles. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, great. Your life is way better that way. But I want to offer that to you, and I don't want to argue about it right now. I don't want to argue for it. I just want to say the university is good for the pursuit of truth. So what are psychedelics good for? What's psychedelic experience good for? Well, I think it's plausible to say that psychedelic experience is good for the pursuit of truth. Not of a single truth, not the psychedelics I've been told of, but of many different avenues and routes that seek experience that is in some sense veridical, that is in some sense interested in the truth. And to offer you just like a tiny parenthetical footnote on this, just because I was just thinking about it the day before yesterday, before Susanna called me, and I think it's relevant to this. In the Middle Ages, when philosophers asked themselves, what is prophecy? And answered, prophecy is an exercise of the imaginative faculty. So I associate this, say, with the great Islamic philosopher Farabi. They didn't mean by imaginative faculty thinking of something that's not real. They meant the opposite of that. Your imaginative faculty in this formulation is not the capacity to picture something that, though it doesn't appear before your eyes, is therefore less real than what you see. To the contrary, your imaginative faculty in this medieval philosophical version of prophecy is what allows you to imagine something that is not before your eyes, but is actually true, is actually deeply true. That is a much more robust and, to my mind, attractive conception of what the imaginative faculty is, full stop. You could leave out the prophecy if you want to. So to the extent that we might think, and this is going to go to the phenomenology of psychedelic experience, to the extent we might think of psychedelic experience as an exercise of the human imaginative faculty, forgive me for using human, but for the sake of my argument here, I'm going to think about human versions of psychedelic experience, not non-human versions of psychedelic experience. That is the human experience of seeking access to truths that might not be immediately visible to superficial sense data. And that's a good thing. That's something that, in principle, all human beings can get behind. And perhaps equally importantly, it's something that could be translated into the languages of law, of religion, and of the humanities. So I'm going to try to do that in the next few moments. But before I do, let me just be really clear about what this thesis is, the thesis about the synthesis. The thesis is this: if we can keep in mind that universities are good for pursuing truth, and that psychedelic experience is also a means of the pursuit of truth, then it's plausible to explain why universities could be places for the pursuit of the study of psychedelic experience. And equally, maybe more importantly, I mean, I do believe that there's tremendous value in the study of truth on its own and for its own sake. But university is not restricted to studying things for their own sake. We do that, we should do it, we must do it, but it's not the only thing we do. We also study and seek after the truth to do things with it in the world, to improve the world, to improve our experiences of the world. So to the extent that we're able to draw for ourselves a picture of the pursuit of truth, that pursuit of truth might well contribute to the world at large. Getting truth is good in itself, and getting truth is good for the world. So that's the game plan here. And the reason for the game plan is if we can bring these things together, then there's a reason to be optimistic in a forward-looking way about how the university can contribute to our overcoming the forms of resistance that we began with, so as to make a difference in the world, and so as to deepen the search for truth on its own terms. I want to give those equal weight here. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. Now I've used the word, there's a hypothesis, there's a thesis, and there's a synthesis, but let's just say that they're all the same for the purposes of this conversation. Okay, so let me try it. Let me try it out with you. And needless to say, I'm trying this out for the first time. So wish me luck. And we have the Q&A for you to tell me how it's going wrong. So let's start with the law. I mentioned to you that the cognitive liberty exemption is one that the law really doesn't want to grant. So in a recent very interesting paper, Jeremy Kessler and David Posen at Columbia Law School have argued that instead of framing the question, the right, as a right to cognitive liberty, a right to psychedelic experience, it would be better to frame it as a right to epistemic discovery. And it will come as a surprise to David because he and I had an email exchange where I objected to this. He's sort of convinced me of the manifest benefits of this formulation because epistemic discovery is closer to the objective of the pursuit of truth that I'm describing. And the law does have some independent commitment to the idea of getting at the truth. Now, that might be relevant not so much as the get out of jail free card, which, as I mentioned to you, is a really hard road to take. I'm not saying don't try it, but it's a very hard road. It's not a road you take thinking you're going to succeed. But epistemic discovery is an important value in this context because it can shed light on the other areas where law is operating in intersection with psychedelics. So it can shed some light on the therapeutic angle because it can say that we need epistemic discovery about the efficacy. And that we not only need to know about the efficacy, but that we need to know something about the mechanism by which efficacy exists, supposing that the data show that it exists. And so seen through that lens, an objective of epistemic discovery can be expanded and extended to put pressure on real government decision makers to expand options. There's an argument that says not just this is just a proposed therapy like any other proposed therapy. This is a proposed therapy with a different approach that is worthy of research on its own because of its relation to experience. And yes, that puts a thumb on the scales against the idea that psychedelic experience is some black box that has efficacy in therapy, if it does, for reasons that we do not know and do not care about. This does put a thumb on the scales of saying it would be really nice if we could identify what it is about the expansionary experience that has positive therapeutic effects. In fact, that if we don't know that, we should be a little worried about just deploying medicine in the same way that we should be worried anytime we deploy any medicine, GLP-1s or whatever, without any, in a very excited way, without much understanding of their mechanisms. If you don't understand mechanisms, you don't understand that much about consequences. Okay, so that's one area in which it can be pushed. The other area where this idea, Kessler and Posen's idea of epistemic discovery can be pushed is in the religious freedom context, where again, the idea would be that the religious liberty right as we know it is not primarily a right to worship. Okay, so here I'm about to mention something that I have not read every single thing that's been written by everyone in this room about this, but I've read a bunch. And I haven't seen this theme emphasized. The theme I've seen emphasized, and this grows out of the doctrine, Jay Michaels and I have talked about this a ton, which means I've listened to Jay, is that the standard model of religious liberty is framed as the right to a sacrament, with the consumption of the psychedelic being analogized to the mystical consumption of sacramental wine or sacramental bread in imitation of Christ's supper. That's the basic structure. That actually sits, that roughly speaking Catholic formulation, though of course there's also Protestant versions of sacrament. But that roughly speaking Catholic formulation actually sits slightly less well with the history of religious liberty under the First Amendment than does a more Protestant formulation. And in the more Protestant formulation, what is valued is the human capacity to find a way to the divine that is based on an inner light. And the idea there is that the epistemic discovery qualities, if you will, extend to spiritual epistemic discovery because they expand the experiential mind in such a way that you get access to different beliefs, truths, and commitments. And I actually think that that resonates more powerfully with the First Amendment tradition, really because the First Amendment tradition grew out of a Protestant America, which was actually pretty skeptical about the sacraments in their Catholic formulation. It's much more interested in the idea of religious exercise in the sense of belief formation than in the sense of the performance of rituals, which to 17th and 18th century Protestants often fell into the category of adiaphora, things indifferent to your salvation. Okay. So that begins my turn to the religion category here and how thinking about psychedelic experience as a search for truth might be relevant to religion and by extension to religious studies. So here, what I want to say, and this is maybe the part of this whole analysis that gave me the idea in the first place, that, and I think it should resonate for people in the room who have engaged with psychedelic experience in relationship to their spirituality, whether wittingly or not, will he or nil he, as you will, if you will, because it's also possible that you set out not to have a specific religious experience with your psychedelic experience, and then you just woke up and you had one. So I think that those experiences can usefully be thought of in relationship to the religious component of a search for truth. And by truth here, I don't mean some mathematical certainty. And I don't mean a dogmatic insistence on one truth. I'm very attuned to your comments from this morning of precisely the multiversal qualities of psychedelic experience. Take that super seriously. But that too is a form of a truth. I think you'd agree. And so seen through that lens, psychedelic experience has a lot to say to the phenomenology of religious experience, and crucially, a lot to learn from the phenomenology of religious experience. This is a two-way street. And no one is going to come into any world where people have spent thousands of years evaluating and analyzing and thinking and be like, hi, everybody, we figured it out for you. And have those people say, oh, that's awesome, come right in. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the natural enthusiasm, and I'm using that term both in its colloquial sense and its technical sense, of people who have recently experienced spiritual revelations is so enthusiastic that it takes the form of the bringing of the good news to people who are pretty sure they already heard the good news, though they're really happy for you that you just heard it a different way. They're like, yeah, we heard that from a scroll and you heard it on Instagram. Awesome. That tone of enthusiasm can sometimes utterly unintentionally, I think, I hope it's utterly unintentionally, but it's definitely unintentional. I hope it's utterly unintentionally, send a message that psychedelic experience has nothing to learn from the varieties of religious experience. That's not true. That's flatly false. It's also dumb. It can't be. It can't be that some immediate experience intuitively grasped and, let us recall, ineffable, can suddenly be effed in such a way as to make entirely irrelevant the full richness of the history of thought and emotion and inner light, to use again a technical term that's relevant here, associated with religious experience. It just doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. The human mind doesn't work that way. And if you are more concerned with the divine mind, just going to say it, the divine mind doesn't work that way either. Okay, so that brings me to the humanities. And how am I doing? I'm about to wrap up, so that's good. I'll have time for some questions. So the humanities are also concerned in a deep way with the pursuit of truth. And so what's needed for the humanities is a kind of engagement with psychedelic experience in relationality to truth that can feel like it belongs in a transformational way. And I'm going to close with a concrete example. And I'll be curious to see what Professor Fawaz thinks about this. It's a novel published in 2024 by a Mexican-American writer called Alvaro Enrique. The English translation of the title is You Dreamed of Empires. And just a show of hands, has anybody in the room read that book? Okay, great. It's short. I don't know how many copies they have in the Coop or in the Harvard bookstore, but everyone here, I promise you, is going to love this book. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but I promise you that this is a book for all of you. I see that Professor Fawaz is like me. He immediately goes on Amazon and orders it. That's what I do. And that's the way to do it. Someone recommended this book to me last week. I ordered it on Amazon. I read it. I didn't see it coming. The title is a reference to a 1636 play by a famous Golden Age Spanish playwright, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, La vida es sueño, Life is a Dream. And what I want to just say, without any spoilers, is that this novel, which is a story of the meeting of Hernán Cortés with Moctezuma in the pre-Mexico city, is a novel in which, and not for nothing, that's a culturally Mayan civilization in which we know for certain we don't need a pseudo-scientific fake theory about how long psychedelics have been used in different contexts to talk about the Mayan civilization, which we know for sure was deeply engaged in psychedelic use. So that's part of that story, in which the historical imagination of what is possible and what matters and what is real and what is not real ends up turning entirely on a conception of the psychedelic and the nature of psychedelic experience. I can't say more without giving it away, but I will note, because this is the kind of thing humanists like, that the title of the book comes from a line in this 1636 play. I had not read that play, but when I went and looked up the play and ordered that on Amazon, this all happened in the last 24 hours, so I apologize to you. It's not okay to refer to it, just for those of you who are students, it's not okay in a lecture to refer to a text as a humanist that you haven't read. So this is not okay, but there are exceptional circumstances. But it turns out that the plot of La vida es sueño, Life is a Dream, the 1636 play, is itself a plot that turns on a mysterious and unnamed drug that is given to a prince to convince him that his brief but nasty time on the throne never happened at all. So this turns out to be a 2024 psychedelic novel that's seeking to open a line to 17th century Spanish drama and reinterpret that in terms of psychedelics. It's also about Borges, if you need any more excitement reasons to engage. There's also, totally out of nowhere, a reference to the music of the band T-Rex. So what I want to say here is that a humanistic account of psychedelic experience will take as its raw material not only the phenomenological reports that people make, but also, and maybe even more importantly, the products of culture that themselves engage with the philosophical and literary and historical questions of the nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality. Just a plug, in the era of AI, we are back to a time when the philosophy of consciousness is everything, because in the history of our imaginings about intelligences that are non-human, every time we imagine a non-human intelligence that could speak, we assumed it would be conscious. Not just HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey, not just C3PO, Space Odyssey, sorry, not just C3PO, but the gods. But we made a machine that can speak as well as we can, that is not conscious. That's for another lecture. I'm actually writing a book about it. But it matters for our purposes to show you that the philosophical inquiry and the humanistic inquiry more broadly into the nature of consciousness, namely, what is it like to be us? And why does that matter? Why does that matter is the single most pressing philosophical question we have. And what do you know? It's the same question that we have to ask in relationship to the experiences of consciousness that we associate with psychedelic experience. So far from being peripheral to the humanities, the questions of consciousness, the meaning of experience, the possibility of experience, and the nature of the real in relationship to sense data are at the beating heart of the humanistic endeavor. So I'm just going to conclude by saying you can see why I feel hopeful and optimistic. The university is a place for the pursuit of truth. Psychedelic experience has as one of its core functions, to my mind, the pursuit of truth in the broadest sense of that term. So the university is a place for engagement with those questions, and that engagement is partly an end in itself. I'm not going to give up on the end in itself point. Sorry, I love me some end in itself for the pursuit of truth. But it is also simultaneously a tool. Truth, the pursuit of truth is a tool for making life better if we believe that truth is good for us. And I do. Thank you. Now tell me I'm wrong, but not all at once. Am I doing the calling on? I see a hand in the back.
Hi. Thank you so much. At the end of Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, I think he proposes nonverbal humanities, and he thinks of psychedelics as a key tool for the nonverbal humanities. So I think that would be very much in line with your suggestion that they serve as tools for the pursuit of truth. But it would also suggest that Harvard would offer the kind of courses that Timothy Leary had wanted to offer, where students would take different substances to open different libraries of Congress in their minds, right? And so if you think of them as epistemic tools, it really raises the question of, would they be part of the curriculum at the end of the day? Or would they be actual research tools?
Well,
and I mean, then you're back to Timothy
those are
Leary,
two different
right?
questions. Yeah, but that does bring you back to Leary. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just say a word. I mean, I love that passage in Doors of Perception. I love the idea of nonverbal humanities. I've just never met one. You know what I mean? You know, it is unquestionably the case that the study of consciousness has to go beyond merely verbal, because what it's like to be us is not just that we're talking all the time. But then go over to like the faculty lounge in a humanities space, and you might kind of think that we're talking all the time. But then that turns out to be true everywhere in the university, because it turns out that it's really difficult to communicate what we think of as truths, without forms of language. And I'm including mathematics as a language here. The key is the communicative element, right? One can study consciousness non-communicatively internally. But communication without language, though I, of course, don't say that that's impossible, it happens. You know, I won't have everybody stare into the eyes of the person next to you and ask you to communicate without language, but it's possible. It's just really hard to get it right, even harder than it is when we communicate with language, when studies suggest we get it like, if we get a third, we're winning. So I'm not closed to the idea of humanities without words. And I'm not closed to the idea that a true humanist wants to have a range of experiences. And I would just close with an example here of a line attributed to, I'm not sure if he's ever admitted to saying it, the great Professor Moshe Edel, who is, most people would consider the greatest living scholar of Jewish mysticism. And Edel was the second generation of great scholars. The first is slightly better known to the general intellectual world, Gershom Scholem, close friend of Walter Benjamin's. And Scholem studied Jewish mysticism from books. Edel also studied it from books, but he would go out and meet mystics and sit with them as they engage in mystical practice. And according to the story supposedly attributed to him, he once said about the book-based study that a person who studies mysticism without having ever had mystical experience is like someone who's a commentator on soccer who's never kicked a soccer ball. Now, you could say in response, some of the greatest, TV commentators are not the former players. So it's not totally clear that you need to do the thing to comment on the thing, to be clear. But there's clearly some benefit to that kind of experience. And I think that's a general principle in the humanities. Please. It's coming. Also gives me a chance to have some water.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Something I'm thinking about, I really hate bringing the pessimistic mood in.
That's fine.
But kind of grounding in your beginning where you were, I guess I'm asking a clarifying question when you said, so we're not doing as badly as these other movements that are, or institutions that are receiving headwinds right now. And if I remember correctly, you mentioned the movement to preserve our biosphere and our constitutional endurance. And
little things.
Yeah. And so the first instinct that I had was, I was like, okay, first of all, I think my tangible question is, when you say we and when you imagine into each of these boxes of the kind of legal framework of psychedelic, futures of psychedelics in the law and the humanities, et cetera, like what are you imagining and who is the we? And like, that's a big question. But I guess when you said that, I was like, actually, I don't know if I'm clear, especially because a lot of these talks point in so many directions.
Sure.
And, but the second thing is that this comes from a place of, even if the headwinds die down and these paths that are in process are quote unquote successful, that these boxes are able to accommodate psychedelics being integrated, I have a hard word, psychedelics coming through them and touching more people's lives. The thing as a young person, for me, is if we're successful in that area, I don't see those boxes as being separate, like the endurance of our Constitution and the more than human world that we are actually deeply embedded in, right? Like if those boxes are not going so well, I don't really know if I want a future where everyone's tripping, if we're all living in a super surveilled world in which like most people don't have access to like really fundamental things. And I think this is a big question.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to break it into two questions. They're both really good. The first is who's we, which is always a good humanist question. Sometimes a dangerous one, but a good one. And then the second one is how important in the hierarchy of needs or of priorities should psychedelic experience be in a world with, I mentioned those, but there are other problems that haven't suddenly gone away just because we didn't talk about them in the last week. We still have structural inequalities in our society on the basis of wealth and the basis of race, and those aren't just national, those are global. And there's any number of things we could go on about, and they're all real, and they're all kind of bad, and they all require serious labor and work. Okay, so on the who's we, I think one of the great things about this conference is, as you said, everything goes in different directions because this is a conference that tries to bring together scholars from different fields, already kind of cool and rare, practitioners from those fields, even rarer, even cooler to combine, and then interested people who are advocates in the public square and are political actors, either at an individual level or at a group level, who are trying to make change in those areas. And there are conferences in the world that try to bring all those groups together. They do exist, but they're really unusual, and they usually end with everyone screaming at each other. So, which this conference does not always necessarily. And so that's the first thing. The we is a very plural we, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And if in my own use of we, I sometimes, pulled my brother just wrote a book about I have two brothers that are both professors. I know it's embarrassing. My brother just wrote a book about liberal education and the problems with it. And he keeps referring to this phrase, sage on the stage, as the kind of pejorative description of what a professor, a humanities professor, or any professor would look like. And I thought it was a funny phrase. I don't think I'd ever heard it before. And I don't usually teach on a stage, so it didn't occur to me, but I got up here and I'm like, hey, I got to play stage on a stage. So yeah, that's like the bad epistemic position of privilege and power and, a suit and a tie and all the bad things. Yeah. So if my we was inappropriately too inclusive, I'm sorry about that. But if my we was under inclusive, I also apologize for that, which brings me to my main point, which is that the whole point of a we is that it's optional if you want to opt in or not. You can hear me say we and you can be like, and not me. I do that a lot when I listen to talks. Or you can hear we and be like, yeah, me too. Great. So that's on the who's we. On the how important it is, honestly, I thought of two answers when you were asking the question, and they were actually diametrically opposed to each other. So the first one I would call the deflationary answer, and you hinted at it. And that's like, yeah, if we face global warming in a way that precipitates all of the disasters that it can precipitate, and I'm naming that as just like, that really is an existential threat to humans, although other animals will do just fine. Then, yeah, the question of psychedelics and the relationship to law and the humanities and religion maybe doesn't seem that important because it isn't. So I'm with you there. But there's also the opposite read, and the opposite read is that we should ask ourselves, like, what's so great about preserving ourselves as humans? I told you guys I'm working on an AI book, and one of the weird things about that is I went out to California. My wife, Julia, said you have to actually talk to the people who are making the AI. And also it's not as cold there in January and February. So we went out to California and spent 6 weeks basically breathing and drinking AI 24/7, 365. I kind of recommend it and I kind of don't. It was amazing. But one of the things that I learned is a lot of people think there's nothing so great about humans and there's no reason to preserve that. A lot of makers in this space who think that. So the response to them is not only the horrified intake of breath that I just heard, though that's a good response to start, but the real question is like, what can you say to that? How do you convince people of the importance of being human? So I made that the title of my book. Now all I have to do is actually convince the people. But here's the thing that's really important about your question. The importance of being human is going to inhere necessarily in the value to us as humans of having human experiences. That's going to be the value. It's not all the good we're doing for other species that, have co-evolved alongside us. We can't be here just for that purpose. Our purpose has got to inhere in some way in the value of our humanness, our aliveness, and our capacity for experience. And so the fields that we're talking about, philosophy of consciousness, history of thought, religious experience in its forms, legal regulation without which we can't solve any problems. Those fields, alongside psychedelic experience, are the core of the study of what's worthwhile about being human. And, the humanities made a turn, roughly 50 years ago that made a lot of sense within context, which was to shift from asking what is valuable about the human condition and how can we preserve it, to noticing that our definition of the human was either exclusionary or intentionally designed to enable forms of oppression. And ultimately, we got a very rich and sophisticated critique of the idea of the human. That was appropriate and necessary. And for this book, I've been reading especially feminist thinkers of the 80s and 90s, people like Donna Haraway, who spectacularly saw what was coming technologically and kind of liked it when it was still sci-fi. Cyborg Manifesto is like unreal, genius, brilliant work. Never understood it myself until AI. But her takeaway, Haraway's takeaway, there is like good. Like a cyborgian world will break down our dichotomies. Posthumanism was read by many, many scholars as like the place we should go. Inspirational ideal, because the idea of the human had been used in all of these ways, which it had indeed been used in. But one weird consequence of this, really weird consequence, is that the people whose job it is, at least historically, to identify what's human and what's good about it, actually haven't done that for about 50 years. And so now we need someone to fight the corner of the human on all of these dimensions. The value of the human in reference to having a planet which has a temperature that we can live on. The value of a constitutional order in which we can pursue our humanity. The value of being human so that we won't live in constant relational communication with machines that aren't conscious and that aren't human, but that fulfill a lot of human functions sort of as well as we do, but not quite. So we need to fight the corner of the human now. And that's what all this is. And that's what psychedelic experience and the study of psychedelic experience is part of. So in that sense, it's in a way the most valuable thing of all. It's in a way the reason that it's worthwhile to try to preserve ourselves. Yes, Professor Fawaz.
Thank you. First of all, the crispness and just, you're bracing. You're like a bracing figure. It's so lovely. It's so delightful.
Thank you.
I want to sort of respond to that question, which I think is so beautiful because it's a question that was asked to me when I was at Berkeley. There was sort of a question that was like, why does any of this matter when Gaza, right? And part of my, this is a comment that I sort of just want you to respond to, is like, I think we on the left and in the leftist humanities have become so obsessed with structure, with deconstructing like neoliberalism and white supremacy and racial capitalism. We've forgotten that humans are psychological beings who have deep psychic needs that existed millennia before any of those systems emerged. Like millennia before patriarchy, humans needed contact with other humans. They needed to feel desired and valued. And then those things got wrapped up in heteropatriarchy and racial capitalism, et cetera. And I think one could say that the question of like preserving democracy and preserving our planet cannot be answered until we psychically feel, as you said, that we are valuable again. Like the abundance of the last 100 years has ironically made us despise ourselves. None of it has brought us sustainable happiness. We're all deeply miserable. And the reason we have such difficulty dealing with these large scale problems is that we are in some ways self-destructive and suicidal. And so I love that you're asked, like one could make the argument politically and legally that we need access to things like psychedelics to get back in touch with that which feels good about being human. So I totally agree with that. And my question to you is like, what is the role of the psychic here and of the psychological difficult? What does it look like for the humanities to take seriously that while we address large structural forms of oppression, we also have to deal with our own bullshit? Like I often make the joke that it's like I sit among faculty members in faculty meetings and I'm like, wow, like I have been dealing with your insecurity about this thing for 10 years. And it's like, I wish you would just go sort out this thing that you feel about medieval literature that's really about you personally and blah, 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 blah. Right. But I do feel that like we are being forced right now as a culture to deal with our psychic dysfunction. And I do think a psychedelic humanities, if we were to call it that, because we did the digital humanities and then that got old, right, would have to deal simultaneously with this really small scale level of tripping and the large scale level of democracy at the same time. And I think that's what I feel like you're gesturing towards that. And I'm interested in what you think of like the psychic dimension of all of this.
First of all, thank you. I want to just applaud that. That was amazing. Thank you. Also, thank you, because now I feel like I did something good, because if it generated that, it's we're on the way. So thank you. You know, there's a thing that only humanists do and no one else on earth does, which is like come into a room where nobody's read a book and give a lecture about that book as though anyone cares, which is like, the only thing worse than that is when people tell you their dreams for a lengthy period of time, you know? So if I were going to try to answer that, I would actually try to answer it with reference to this Alvaro Enrique book that I was describing, which is about getting over our bullshit, and about how our bullshit drives us, and also about how at the biggest scale, democracy or monarchy, or in this case, empire, and it's not just any empire, this is literally a book about the moment of contact and all of the terrible, terrible things that are coming, is a trip. It's all a trip, you know? I mean, I suppose if we were in the 1960s again, if we really want to play Back to the Future, you would say it was a power trip. But I think from our own perspective, you can see that that's an understatement of what kind of a trip it is. Power trip is only one kind of trip that it is. So I think what it would look like is looking at all of our individual experiences, what it's going to feel like when we walk out into the sun, coupled with, you know, all of the different institutional moving parts of like any conference, and all of the personal features that motivate us to get up and do our thing. And, you know, how you chose your outfit today, and how I chose my outfit today, and how we, you know, all of that, we'd look at all of it and we'd see both how it signifies. That's the part where the humanities is already pretty good at. The part where we see how that all signifies, and also how it doesn't signify at all. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.